Hey everybody, welcome to Reach and Reverie. Today we are going to talk about soil blends and how I make my soil. Before we get started, I do want to show you what I did this weekend. I painted some raised garden beds. I didn't get to paint the ones in the back, but I did go ahead and paint our arched cattle panel trellis and pretty cantaloupe orange. I painted the two big pots right here, a really beautiful light blue, blue-green. And then our dear friends, Zach and Alyssa, they actually moved away this weekend and gifted us the garden beds that they used last year. And this one came to us already painted brown, and we went ahead and kept the brown trim and painted the main sides a really pretty wildflower yellow, and then painted the lumber raised garden bed box a lavender purple. We think these are gonna go really good this year in our growing space and just kind of add a beautiful, light, fun color scheme to our gardening space. Today we are going to talk about how I make my soil blend step by step. I like to blend my soil in a wheelbarrow 4 cubic feet at a time, since my gardening space is relatively small. Our growing space are going to include these garden beds that you see right here, as well as our garden that's in the back of our yard over there. Our gardening space over there is a 16 by 16 foot growing space. I have 2 raised beds that are 8 feet by 3 feet long, and we also utilize 3 of the 4 walls as growing space as well. As you join me for this step-by-step soil guide, I also want to invite y'all along as we explain what each ingredient is used for, as well as the pros and cons of each of those ingredients. I like to start with peat moss, and I buy these by the 3.8 cubic foot sized bags. Every time I use my soil blend, I am going to be using 1/4 of the bag of peat moss for every wheelbarrow that we fill up. Alright guys, so I added 1/4 of that peat moss bag to our wheelbarrow, and this is what the peat moss looks like. You can see it's really light and fluffy and a really nice soft texture. Peat moss helps your soil stay moist longer if you have soils that are heavy in sand, but it also helps your soil drain better if your soils are heavy in clay. So in general, peat moss can be a great addition to your soil to help balance the moisture levels of the blend you want to use. It is important to note that peat moss is somewhat acidic. I like to buy my peat moss in bags of 3.8 cubic feet. I feel like that is most cost effective for the projects that I like to do. I'm buying these bags at about $15 a bag. Next, we are going to add 2 bags of manure. These bags come in 0.75 cubic foot sized bags. All right, so I added the manure, the 2 bags, into the wheelbarrow. You can see the texture is a little denser. It's more moist than the peat moss starting out, and it's also a lot darker in color next to the peat moss. Now, this is manure that we're talking about, so be sure that once you're done with your project, go inside and wash your hands. Manure adds organic matter to your soil blend. It helps grow healthy plants, but keep in mind that too much manure in your soil blend can cause more leafy growth of the plants at the cost of fruit production. That's because manure is really high in nitrogen, and nitrogen makes plants grow, but it can also burn your plants, so be careful. Too much manure can also cause an explosion of bad bugs in your raised garden beds. I had to deal with this last year with roly-polies. Roly-polies are detritivores, which means they like to eat organic matter as it decomposes. Roly-polies can be detrimental to your garden growing because they love to eat the tender roots and stems on your little seedlings. So there is such thing as too much of a good thing. You want to make sure that you balance your manure ratio to your peat moss ratio. I like to buy my manure locally at our garden supply store. I am buying the 0.75 cubic feet bags for about $3 a bag. Now, once we have the manure nice and settled into our wheelbarrow, I am going to add Horticultural Vermiculite. When I'm shopping around for vermiculite, I'm always careful to choose horticultural vermiculite that's asbestos free. Evie! Evie decided to join us. Hi! How was your walk? You just got back from a walk? It was nice, huh? You want to join us on our soil video? Vermiculite helps to aerate the soil. It also helps to hold in nutrients in the soil that may otherwise run off through overwatering. Vermiculite also helps keep soils moist for longer as it retains a lot of water. This is great for where I live in the Chihuahuan Desert, where it only rains a handful of times a year. It can save us money by helping us not to use up quite as much water in the heat of the summer. In really wet and rainy climates, you might want to be careful using vermiculite if you tend to overwater your plants, because it is going to help keep the soils moist for longer. So in a really wet environment, if you use too much vermiculite, that could actually help bleed and cause your plants to have root rot. So that's something to keep in mind before you go out and buy that bag. Although vermiculite by itself is pH neutral, in a soil blend, it attaches to compounds in the soil that can cause an alkaline reaction. This actually helps lower the pH in soil blends that have a little bit more acidity. Now, lowering the acidity might sound like a good thing, but in reality, it really depends on what you're trying to grow. Some plants, like blueberries, love acidic soils, so if you go in and add vermiculite and it lowers the pH of a soil and makes it more alkaline and less acidic, that's not going to be as good of a growing environment for your blueberries. So you might want to consider using something like perlite, which doesn't affect the pH of the soil like vermiculite does. Vermiculite can be a great addition to your soil blend in your raised garden beds. However, a pH meter can be a great, inexpensive, handy tool to help keep you on track as far as target pH goes in your soil blend. To try to stay as cost effective as possible, I tend to buy my vermiculite by the 4 cubic foot sized bags. Whenever I buy my vermiculite, I spend about $50 on a bag. Now, it goes a long way. In a 4 cubic foot bag, I am adding 1 scoop at a time to each wheelbarrow. It's gonna last for a few seasons on our little homestead. Perlite is another option that you can use as an aerator for your soil blend, either with or in place of vermiculite. Perlite is another soil aerator, but that's pretty much where the similarities end between perlite and vermiculite. Perlite helps with the drainage of your soil. That means that perlite is better for rainy and wet environments. You can use perlite and vermiculite together. Perlite is a little bit cheaper than vermiculite. I got mine for about $35 for a 4 cubic foot bag. Today, I'm not going to be adding perlite to my soil blend just because of those factors we talked about. I like to make my own soil blend just like this for a few different reasons. One, I simply like to know what goes into my soil. But I also feel like my garden produces better when I make my own soil blend. Last season, I had a few areas where I made my own soil, and then I had a few areas where I just bought potting soil mix. And the areas where I made my own soil, they produced so much better. The plants lived longer, grew bigger. It was just not even a fair comparison. So every year from now on, I plan on making my own soil. Now, I don't go this route to try to be cheap, and I highly doubt that whoever coined the term dirt cheap ever tried to grow a garden. This right here is my basic soil blend. There are some additional optional ingredients that I like to add to different beds depending on what I'm growing in those beds. So let me go ahead and mix this all together and show you what it looks like. All right, it's all mixed up. This is what the basic ingredients look like, all blended together. If I'm growing melons or squash, I also add a few cups of sand to this. Sand offers better drainage than perlite. I am going to add some alfalfa pellets. Alfalfa pellets are great for heavy feeding plants. Consider it a natural, slow release fertilizer. They are a legume that's high in nitrogen. They add trace minerals and vitamins back into the soil. They break down over the season, so a little bit goes a long way. Alfalfa in the pellets feeds the plants. The molasses that are in these horse pellets feed the microorganisms in your soil. There are a few drawbacks to consider before you go grab the bag of alfalfa pellets at your local feed store. Molasses is great for your soil generally, but it can also feed bad bacteria in your soil. If you already have soil issues, that's something to look into. But no risk, no reward. So today, I'm adding them. A little bit goes a long way. Too much fertilizer on your plants can give you the opposite effect than what you're going for. Alfalfa in my area typically goes for about $11 for a 50-pound bag. So this is all that I'm gonna add to my soil today. I'm gonna blend them up and probably make a couple rounds of soil because it takes 4 wheelbarrows to fill up the yellow garden bed that I have behind me. All right, so I mixed in the alfalfa pellets. You don't want too many of them in here, so be mindful of that. And it also just depends on how much organic matter you have in your soil already. If you already have an existing soil bed, I would just sprinkle on a couple handfuls of these over your whole bed and don't even worry about it mixing them in. Once it's time to transplant my starts, I'm gonna add stronger fertilizers. I like to use blood meal and bone meal. Blood meal is a fast-acting fertilizer. I just sprinkle at the base of my plants and water in. Blood meal adds nitrogen for plant growth, great for developing plants. It adds acidity to the soil though. It is strong stuff. I use about 1 tablespoon per plant monthly. And 1 5-pound bag cost me $7. I also like to add bone meal, which adds calcium and phosphorus to your garden. Bone meal is great for root growth, bloom, and fruit development. It only works in soil that has some acidity to it, however, so keep that in mind and keep that pH meter handy with you. I only add bone meal about once every other month, about a tablespoon per plant, typically at the beginning of the season and then again as the plants start to flower and develop fruit. Bone meal is just about the same price as blood meal, going about $7 for a 5-pound bag. One ingredient that I almost forgot to mention that I don't add until it's time to transplant my starts out of the greenhouse and into their permanent homes in the raised garden beds are worm castings. I typically follow the instructions on the bag and I just add a little bit around the area where I'm going to transplant my seedlings into the soil right before I do transplant them. All right, that's 1 wheelbarrow full right here. Only a few more rounds to go and then this thing is going to be filled up. This evening I did direct sow some frost hardy vegetables into this side of my arched cattle panel trellis bed. I started some peas right along the trellis line so they can grow up the trellis, and then I also started radishes and more carrots. My logic behind this is I'm thinking that by the time it's time for me to transplant my Malabar spinach out into these beds, it's going to be about the time where I'm going to start pulling out my peas, and then I can transplant my Malabar spinach out, and the radishes and carrots I can just pull out as they mature, and they shouldn't be in too much competition with that Malabar spinach. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I want to give you guys a huge thanks because today, February 3rd, we reached 100 subscribers and I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and you'll see more content just like this.